right, Adam, I want to welcome you to the show today.
Hey, everybody.
So we got connected on LinkedIn. I was super impressed with your background, and we got a chance to ask you questions about it. And I'd love just to give everybody a lens of kind of the width and depth of your background. Can you just give us there's no possible way we could do a Cliff Notes version because you just have so much experience. But if you can give everybody just sort of lens, so before we get into some of the meat and potatoes, what your background is.
Of course, of course. So I've been in what we now think of information and information security technologies for decades at this point. I've been doing it longer than the concepts around our little community have existed. But I, first and foremost, really split my time primarily between consulting in and across multiple industry sectors and education. I've been a trainer and a consultant, both for many, many decades, working with companies, governments, the military, all over the world. And I do focus on anything infrastructure and security related, primarily for the most part these days. But I work with and have worked for companies as a consultant in the Fortune 500 and 100 across the world, helping them to manage infrastructure and understand security and risk.
Fantastic, fantastic. So we have quite a conversation we're going to be planning for today, and I think one of the big issues we have is insecurity and networking and this global connection of equipment and devices and software around the world is complexity, and I think it's very easy to get sucked into the tactics of complexity, and instead of taking a step back and as IT business leaders and think how can we navigate it. But that's just my perception. What do you think is the best way to start from? Why should someone approach this from a strategy perspective versus a tactical, versus what I just said? I think it's a way to navigate complexity. But what are your thoughts on that?
Sure. So traditionally, right, we often think about three levels when I say we, I mean any of us, regardless of what we do professionally or personally in our own lives, right? We can often think about three ways we address or approach any situation. Strategically, as you suggested, Bill, tactically, right? But then we have something in the middle, which is the operational level, right? Okay. We don't often think about those levels consciously, but we do kind of act accordingly. And when we think about strategy, whether we're solving a specific business need or a requirement, or we're figuring out the best way to get to work without getting stuck in traffic, right? Anything in between, it kind of applies across the board. We want to try to remove ourselves from the moment and really think more broadly about the choices, the decisions, the opportunities, right, that we may address and the best path to get there. But we want to think beyond the immediacy of the particular issue and see all those additional connections, dependencies, things that feed into it as variables. That's really what strategy should help us to do. That broad, big picture people are always talking about, but we never seem to bring into focus. When we think operationally, we're thinking about how we make that strategy, those really big picture thoughts, become more tangible, more realistic, more manageable. Managing being a key word when we think about operational activities, because we want to start scoping and tailoring. We want to be able to streamline and really think about how we can take these grand ideas that strategy provides us with and bring them down to earth, kind of the 25,000 foot versus 50,000 foot level view, slowly but surely closing in so that instead of saying we want to move to the cloud, if that's our strategy, we begin operationally to say, what is it going to take to move to the cloud? Who's going to be involved? And what should we be thinking about? And how are we going to begin to not only plan, but ultimately execute those activities? And then finally, as we think about tactical, it's really about that ground level view, right? It's that rubber meets the road thought process we often talk about. It's the execution of the strategy with the guidance of the operational thoughts that have helped us to narrow and ultimately focus our activities. And so it's about process and procedure. How are we going to do things, and what is it that we're going to do? And as we take those together, kind of mix them up and use them to guide our activities, when I meet with customers, when I talk to students, peers, colleagues, people like you, as we chat, I try to remind them that when we get stuck thinking about only one of the three pillars, right, we do ourselves, and by extension, everybody around us that relies on us, a disservice because we're not seeing a complete picture. We're really only talking about one way in which we can envision, perhaps then tailor to get a one-size-fits-one as we move to operationalizing and ultimately executing, right, to get to that solution. We only see a very small piece of the whole puzzle, and we often make the mistake of thinking that's what we need to focus on, that's the immediacy, when it's all three that really come together to help us to solve problems.
So this is really good. So I didn't really think about it from that three-legged. I think most of us are used to tactical, strategic, but you put in the operational. But let's use your example of I have to move to the cloud. I want to move to the cloud. Is that strategy, or is that just a target destination? And I know I'm kind of catching you here in this, but if you heard that from a business, I need to move to the cloud. Is that strategy, or is that just an objective, and we need to more ground that into, I want speed and agility for launching new products, or I want something that has some impact in there? I just want to get your thoughts on that.
So, when someone says to me or says to you, as you just said to me, I want to move to the cloud, I don't think of any of those things that you just mentioned, because I step back in my mind and I want to encourage them to do the same thing. We walk it through. And I say, okay, Bill, if you're my customer, we're having this conversation. You come to me and say, well, Adam, I have heard this thing called the cloud is great. I want to be there. All my friends are there. I'm not. I feel left out. I want to go to the cloud, meaning my company needs to go to the cloud. First thing we have to do is not say, Bill, that's awesome. Let's go spend all this money that you have laying around that you're not putting to use, because I have a solution for you. I have the perfect cloud for you. I don't have anything for you because I don't know what you mean. Right? When you say, I want to move to the cloud, that can mean so many things, right? And what I want to do, not only, as someone who is interested in helping you as a consultant, an advisor, a partner, but just as somebody who seeks clarity before I jump into a problem solving mentality, I need to step back a couple levels and drag you with me, often kicking and screaming, because you're not willing to go there. You've already jumped ahead and made the commitment in your mind. Now you want to go execute things, right? What we need to do is step back and say, okay, well, you're framing what potentially is a requirement, a need, a strategy, and an objective, as well as an end point to my destination. All five of those things are potentially wrapped up in that loaded statement, but none of them are clear. What we need to do is clarify and define those. And so we need to first understand by asking some questions, essentially requirements gathering 101. What is it that your definition of moving to the cloud entails? What do you think, Bill, is the cloud? How do we define that for your business, your needs? What are your problems, your requirements you're trying to address? Because we may find that moving to the cloud is not really any of the things we just described it as. It's a statement that somebody's put in your head and convinced you is going to solve a problem that doesn't exist or isn't going to be facilitated, right, by moving to the cloud. It may make it worse as opposed to better. And so we need to define the problem statement. And then once we have that, we can figure out whether moving to the cloud is an element of success, and if so, where does it fit in? Or if it will become perhaps a hindrance or roadblock, or perhaps it's value neutral and we should do it, but we have to link it to the broader strategy of solving the business requirements and problems you've identified and show where that value lays in relation to what we're going to layer in to make that solution happen. So I think it's a great opportunity question, right? But it's very open-ended, it's very qualitative, and we can't solve problems qualitatively. We need to quantify them in order to figure out how to solve them. And then we can qualitatively assess and understand how to add value. But most people back into it the opposite way. They say, this is where I'm going. And now that I've made my mind up, let me go fill in all the details and try to build this path. And hopefully I make the two connect. We need to define what you want to do, and then we need to figure out the path in order to get there.
Yeah, it's almost like the statement, because we hear this quite a bit. I want to move to the cloud, and they're probably already partially there, but it's also a vision. I think a vision, the way I like to look at a vision is, you're never going to reach it because it's a horizon. You're sprinting towards the horizon, but the horizon is constantly moving. So the vision is at broad strokes. Potentially, we might not achieve it in this lifetime. I mean, it's a big vision. So we're going to backing into that vision is important. And I really like the way you've gone with this, because from the operations, which you said, scoping and tailoring
Mhm.
that strategy, and then the tactical, which is where the rubber was kind of making it real and repeatable. And from team perspective, so the talent that's needed today is different than behind the firewall just 5-10 years ago. And so what do you look at from a team perspective is needed from skills and development to be able to deal with this world that we're in right now, is particularly from the operational and the tactical perspective?
So, it's a great question because things have changed, right? And they always are changing. This is not a new time that we live in, although it is certainly a very chaotic one. There's no doubt about it. But in terms of the pace of change, I think it's fair to say that while major disruptive events are occurring around us, global pandemics tend to facilitate that, right? Not to mention the speeding up and just the massive additional burdens that has caused in terms of technology shift, people working remotely, the displacement of the traditional office worker, and the security issues associated with that, right, have really come together to cause tremendous concern, but I think also opportunity. I think the shift in skills is sometimes overplayed and I think sometimes understated, right? I think it's a duality that we have to acknowledge. You've been hearing for many years now about the skill gaps, supposedly. I'll put that in the proverbial air quotes, right? The skill gaps that exist in IT and IT security in particular. Woe is us, right? Because we don't have enough people to stand on the wall and keep the bad people at bay. But the reality is that while we always need more people and we always need people that are willing to skill up and to do so dynamically, we have the people. I think the problem is we don't have the strategies and the ability to direct that desire and that potential mind value that people
The clarity,
bring.
and you mentioned the clarity, like being clear. I think there's never been a more important time to be clear as a leader.
It's a very important time to be clear, and I think it's not only about clarity and the lack perhaps thereof, right? Because there certainly is a lack of clarity without getting into any of the places and details and reasons why it may or may not exist. But there certainly is a lack of clarity. But I think that it's not only at the most senior levels beyond the boundaries of business. I think we have seen tremendous movements on the parts of nation states to disassociate themselves and isolate themselves in some respects. And, history is a cyclical enterprise, right? It does repeat. And as we all know, woe to the person, right, who doesn't understand history because you're doomed to repeat it. We see movements in many areas to essentially become islands of isolation in a sea of partnering. And it's troubling in some respects. I think it's something that occurs from time to time. Understanding your supply chain and figuring out how to manage it closer to home is going to be one of the strategic advantages that companies have to figure out how to nail if they're going to survive and thrive in the new age of where we're seeing these things move to. But, that's not a new thing. It just hasn't been a thing that's caused concern because we've made it so easy to not pay attention to the fact that other people are managing our ability to survive and thrive and provision ourselves, that we just have kind of turned a blind eye to it, become comfortable as one example. Now that it's uncomfortable, now that it's not easy to say, well, what do you mean you can't get that for me and I can't get it in just in time, delivery or whatever that model would have been. And what do you mean I'm not going to get it? And people are being caught short. It's causing confusion. I think the strategies that we as individuals, as IT professionals, as C-level executives in companies have to be thinking about are broadly encompassing the ways in which we create ecosystems that create success and how we manage those close to home while allowing for the understanding that we're not going to do everything ourselves. It's fallacy to say that we can be isolated and still be successful in a global economy that is interconnected. That's never going to change. The time to be isolated where we weren't globally connected was 150 years ago for the advent of modern technology. So since we don't have time travel now, we can't go backwards as far as I know now, we'll wait 10 seconds, see if I was wrong. I might show up from the future and say I was wrong, but assuming I'm right, and that's not going to happen anytime soon, we have to go forward, right? Because treading water essentially means that you're slowly but surely falling behind. You just don't see it because you're not as readily being affected by it. And if we're moving forward, we have to acknowledge the fact ultimately that while it's scary to envision having to partner with companies, with entities, with governments, with people that may or may not share our values, that we have to be smart about how we do that to maximize our success and minimize our risk. I mean, this is the same conversation humans have had since we emerged, right?
Yeah.
From the earliest depths of time, figured out fire, made tools, and said, you know what, we got to partner together to go hunt that big animal over there because we're not going to eat otherwise. And nothing has changed since then, except we've made better tools, and it's getting harder to find animals because there aren't as many of them around. But we just are improving on the same things we've done for thousands of years. And technology makes that incredibly easy in some respects. Back to your original point, you know, what are the skills behind the firewall today that we need? I don't think it's that so much that there's a skill gap. I think, as we said, it's the strategy and vision that's allowing that gap to widen because we're not addressing it as a fundamental risk that requires us to remediate, right? We're saying, you know, cloud, it's okay. We're paying people, we're transferring our risks, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, whoever. They'll manage it. They have people, right? All we have to do is click some buttons and for the most part, things work. How hard is it to click a button? Well, it's not easy to click the right button all the time and know what's going to happen when you do and link it to the other buttons, right, that you're clicking, regardless of what they tell you about automating. And so while we come up with really great stories, pretty pictures, and fancy sounding frameworks like DevOps and SecDevOps and continuous integration, continuous deployment, continuous this, whatever it is, the flavor of the day, you know, we're not changing the fundamental arc of the vision we have to address. We're changing the words we use to describe what we think that story means. And it's okay to tell better and different stories as long as we can still understand how to address the fundamentals that allow us to be successful. I think the challenge we're seeing in organizations is that C-level executives continue to be stuck in the past, challenged by old assumptions about risk that are not fundamentally true on the ground. We're not going to be successful by simply protecting our network perimeter because our network perimeter is carried in the pocket of every worker that accesses your network anywhere in the world and is sitting in a coffee shop or sitting on the street in a car accessing wireless or is in a hotel lobby or 50,000 feet up in the air traveling at 700 miles an hour on a plane. And as a result, maybe not as much today, but in general, right, when we get back to normal, that's where it will be. And it's, by the way, it's been that way for over a decade. We just haven't realized that. And as a result, unless we fundamentally change what it means to understand how to manage perimeter, you know, this is where something like a zero trust architecture comes in, a zero trust framework, because I don't agree with the idea of it being an architecture, because it's not an architecture. It is a collection of best practices, principles, and workflows, right, that taken together yield our ability to understand how to change the dynamic of risk in the organization. But it's where a framework like zero trust becomes very valuable. And while it's great that NIST has finalized it, put it out, made it commonsensical, and formalized it, you know, to be fair to NIST, they've done a lot of work, and all the people associated with that project done tremendous work to make it a reality, but they've simply codified and put into a sensical form common sense thoughts that have been around for decades, right?
So
and we just haven't paid attention to them. That's the problem. And I think it's about getting our skilled workers, our frontline practitioners, the people that are going to be tactically executing, the right level of guidance and giving them a directive and a set of principles they have to go after in terms of that strategy and operationalizing it to come up with a one-size-fits-one solution within our organizations. That makes that skill gap disappear because now everybody has a job and they know where to go to do it and what to do. And those things will then take care of themselves. I often tell my customers, I don't need 150 people on your team to be skilled up to manage your cloud infrastructure, neither do you. You need a plan to understand how to manage the risks associated with investing in the cloud. And once we figure out that plan, we'll find the appropriate people with the right skills in your organization. And if they're not there, we'll get them trained, but we'll then have a really solid playbook. And we'll assess that playbook ongoing, right, to make sure it aligns.
So do you think, so I like how you took my tactical question and flipped it strategic, which was great. And in how CIOs and business IT leaders, there's this shift between, you and I were both around during the outsourcing model in the, the late 80s, 90s. Everybody wanted to outsource this, outsource to China and all over the world and all sorts of places. And that was a big strategic shift. And now putting things that are strategically useful and helpful to develop speed. I just was talking to an insurance company just a couple of days ago, and they have all these partners that they've partnered with, and they're now making a strategic shift to pull a lot of that capability back in-house because they don't have speed, and they don't have speed to market. It's too much collision domains within the communication between different partners. And then I like how you went to this commonality that we all common denominator we have right now, which is everybody is untethered. Everyone is, well, not everybody, but just about everybody is untethered, at least in the Western world, to systems. And if we're going to work in the modern environment, what is the 80-20? What is the Pareto principle? That's the 80-20 that we can apply. And basically you said is risk management. So in this cloud world, how can we manage risk? And maybe that can be a segue into like this next part of this conversation, which is, all right, if the commonality is we're all untethered, all working, or at least want the ability to all work untethered, and we want to have partners that have speed of collaboration, and we need to have trust. How do we do that? What would be, is zero trust? And maybe we should start by what is zero trust, and what are your thoughts on that statement?
Right. So, I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago as we were just chatting through that I love, right, what NIST has done to formalize and all the people associated with it. When I say NIST, I mean the umbrella organization that's brought that together, the zero trust architecture. And it's labeled an architecture. And as I said, I don't have a problem with it, but I take exception a little bit with the definition. NIST itself kind of, shoots its own arrow in this area. When you read the abstract of the actual document, they go out of their way to say zero trust architecture, but wait a second, because it's not a traditional architecture, it's a collection of all these other things. And it sounds like it is a framework, but that's semantics. That doesn't really matter. What I think ultimately about zero trust is that it is a collection of things that for some of us, depending on where you come from, what you've been doing and your perspectives, is very comfortable and very familiar, right? Because it is about moving the boundary that has been static and stayed and traditionally stuck at the network boundary, the gateway boundary of our interactions between what is internal, what is external, that traditional mythical wall we talk about, and really focus there for decades with regards to architecture, discussions around design, technology implementation, and all the stuff we do. That's where our focus has been to create our protection perimeters and our abilities to carve out safe zones on either side and perhaps between those perimeters as we envision technology. What really made that change, and it has changed for some time. I just think we're very late to acknowledge it formally because we've been so caught up in the wow factor of what the new shiny thing is that we're chasing that's caused the change, has been the collision of cloud and virtualization, right? And this idea that perhaps about 10 to 15 years ago, approximately, we're sitting here in late 2020, chatting about technology. So, right after the non-happening end of the millennium concerns we had, right? And the issues associated with turning the clock into the 2000s, right? To the 21st century. Boy, that was a fun time, right? If you went through that. And, thinking about that and saying, okay, well, the world hasn't ended. So now we actually have to think about what we're going to do differently. And, we saw really a lot of interesting and emerging technologies. Virtualization was coming into its own in a meaningful way right around that time. When I say meaningful, we had concepts associated with virtualization prior to 2000, but it hadn't really jumped to the enterprise level. VMware was just starting to become a force to be reckoned with in that space, right?
Citrix was big?
Yeah, and you know, Microsoft hadn't really figured out that virtualization was where money was going to be, so they hadn't bothered to pay attention to it. They were still focused on, you know, trying to take over the world by taking over desktops. And as a result, you know, VMware was able to carve out this niche that in the beginning everybody thought was a boutique, kind of off in the corner, crazy solution that, you know, fast forward 20-ish years has grown to dominate the modern ecosystem that we think of. And I would challenge anybody listening to us to come up with a solution, a scenario that envisions modern enterprise architecture and infrastructure. What's sitting behind me in our data center here, and in yours as we talk about this, and envision a racked and stacked data center world, whether it is on premises, whether it is strictly cloud, whether it is hybrid, whether it is multi-cloud, or the latest and greatest marketing fad that people have to discuss the fact that we can't cram everything into one place anymore. And to say that you can do that without virtualization, because although I certainly have customers that understand that there is a need to own their own infrastructure, perhaps in a physical form still, few and far between compared to yesteryear, but certainly still many. Let's exclude government and military and highly regulated industries that have their own specific reasons for perhaps needing physical infrastructure. And the reality is for most modern businesses, especially in the SMSB space, right? The small and medium-sized business SMSB space, the reality is you are not going to be able to survive and continue to thrive if you're wedded to this old idea of a physical footprint that involves iron stacked in a room, right? It doesn't make sense from a cost benefit perspective. You could turn that capital expense investment into OpEx by simply transferring risk and renting infrastructure. That's what the cloud represents. And you can't do cloud at scale in the enterprise in the modern world we think of today without virtualization, right? You could virtualize without the cloud. You can't do cloud at scale without virtualization.
Right.
It's just not possible. And we figured that out right around, you know, the early 2000s as we began to see the emergence of what would become the modern ecosystem. And as a result of that, while you fast forward and all of that is slowly but surely coming to focus, falling into place, right? You know, you've got consolidation in those sectors. Dell has been gobbling up almost everybody for the last several years, right? They own not only VMware and by extension now EMC because they bought VMware, but Carbon Black and many of the other key leaders and industry, you know, sectors, right? That they're aggregating together. The question remains whether they can make that ecosystem function at scale, right, profitably and ultimately with a strategy that entices business leaders to say, I want to go all in on a single vendor platform, right? But ultimately, you've got that competitive voice that's becoming much louder, that hybrid, which is now becoming multi-cloud, because for years we just called it a hybrid environment. I got some stuff there and I got some stuff out there somewhere. Well, out there now is not just out there, it's out there with Azure, it's out there with AWS, it's out there with GCP, right, Google Cloud, it's out there with Oracle Cloud. There is an Oracle Cloud business, by the way, even though people often forget about that, right? It's out there with IBM, it's out there with Dell, right, with VMware, who's trying to become the global connector to all those clouds and create, right, a new business model around multi-cloud by partnering with everybody and creating connections to manage everything. You've got companies like Aviatrix, that is a single pane of glass multi-cloud management engine that scales using Terraform and covers Aviatrix, right? That covers up the complexities of how to scale and automate across multi-cloud and says, you know what, we'll just give you a product that will link to everything and we'll give you a single pane of glass with a really great front-end web API to let you manage it all. And instead of you having to figure out Terraform and Puppet and Salt and Chef and all the other stuff that goes with it, we're just going to give you straightforward solutions that are relatively easy to deploy. There's all these options, right, that exist out there, which is great. But we're missing the most fundamental core piece of that, which has not caught up and has not come into focus. It's easy to provision services. It's easy at scale to, when I say easy, relatively speaking, it's easy to automate them at scale. But what we're doing is amplifying risk and automating risk, right? And turning a blind eye to threat. And the problem becomes that regardless of platform, regardless of vendor, regardless of architecture, I don't hear and I don't see and I don't have the confidence in the conversations that are occurring for the most part to see and hear that people are saying this technology is great, we need virtualization, it enables cloud, we need cloud, we can't live without cloud, gotta have cloud. But what I don't hear is we gotta have risk management and threat assessment and security that is appropriate for cloud. I hear we have those things in our old on-premise world, and we're trying to stretch them and elastically apply them and wrap them right through encapsulation around cloud. But I don't hear that we're changing and reinventing and recreating those thought processes to include a new vision from the ground up of cloud. And when I tell people that, they say, well, but we have CASBs and we have, we have application threat management and threat intelligence at scale in the cloud. We have AI and business intelligence and machine learning capabilities. And you have all these platforms, right? Mandiant's FireEye is a great example. Nessus is a great example. These are all cloud enabled today, right? Heck, you can get the Metasploitable framework, right? And you can use it to your own benefit to secure your network instead of it being used to attack you now, right? Because it's become mainstream and fashionable for hacker tools to become, now used for defense. All those things are good, but they're isolated issues and concerns that are being addressed without a holistic plan. And things like the CMMC, things like the zero trust architecture, they are attempts to be able to, less so with the CMMC, because it's really specific and unique to the military, right, and the approach of government and the military by extension to dealing with risk. But it is broadly applicable to the corporate sector if you're smart enough to think about it. It's just that everybody says, oh, it says government, I shouldn't do that. It's too cumbersome and complex. But the reality is that those are attempts to try to broaden the conversation at the strategic and the operational levels to get those elements integrated into a framework and an approach that can then be tailored to a one-size-fits-one solution for private enterprise. I think that's the piece that we miss. We just don't have that. And
yeah, I love that. So you're saying that the way to approach this complexity of the way to approach security from a strategy perspective is looking at it from, because when you get into CASB and this product, that product, and threat management, it's so tactical that you get lost in the quagmire. You're saying you're going to need to elevate it to the level of like zero trust or CMMC, but maybe we can just tear apart zero trust for a moment. What is zero trust for folks that are trying to understand it right now, maybe in the small to medium enterprise marketplace?
Sure. So let me share with those people, right? Just while we're talking, I know you can't see it. I'm just going to put it up on my screen, but let me share with you some language that's not mine, but specifically is coming from the people that wrote the architecture, the framework, right? NIST and the authors, right? This is from the cover abstract page within the document, right? Page number 1, if you're looking at or understanding and want to know more about it. By the way, the NIST document we're talking about, right? The zero trust architecture is NIST SP. SP stands for Special Publication. NIST SP 800-207. 800-207 is the formal name and number designation for the zero trust architecture document NIST has just published in the last couple of weeks towards the middle to end of 2020. A zero trust architecture, what's called the ZTA, the acronym that is used, is an enterprise cybersecurity architecture based on zero trust principles and designed to prevent data breaches and limit internal lateral movement. Goes on to say it is not a single architecture. This is the piece that I, right, have been calling out, but rather a set of guiding principles for workflow. Workflow is how we do things and how we document and envision visually, and ultimately execution-based, how we design and ultimately execute a process and lay it out, right? That's what workflow is. So guiding principles for workflow, system design, and operations that could be used to improve the security posture of any classification or sensitivity level, and it refers to the FIPS guidance in FIPS 199, the Federal Information Protection and Processing Standards for Security. And it says transitioning to ZTA is a journey concerning how an organization evaluates risk in its mission and cannot simply be accomplished with a wholesale replacement of technology. And it goes on to say that, having said that, many elements of the ZTA are already in place in organizations, but are not holistically linked with a strategy and a plan. Rather, they exist as these free-floating elements we've identified and discussed, and they're not managed holistically. And as a result, they're often chaotically canceling each other out, perhaps banging into each other, working at cross purposes. What the ZTA tries to achieve is to reorient anybody, small, medium, large, uber large, super large business, doesn't matter. Tries to reorient that thought process, identify those elements that exist, gap analyze what is not there that should be, fill in the picture so that we have a road that is smooth and purposeful towards our objectives of minimization of risk, management of change, because you can't do one without the other. Those two are interrelated. Achieve our strategic results. You said early in our conversation, you're chasing that vision on the horizon strategy on an ongoing basis. And you never get there because it's always receding. I beg to differ. I think it's a question of how you choose to ultimately define what the horizon is and what you're chasing. I think you do have these long-term strategic visions that are going to take years, perhaps decades to move towards. And you always have to have those, and they always have to be a movement lateral and ultimately out into the unknown to continue to move the organization forward. I don't disagree with you about that at all. But I think as part of that, you have to carve pieces off of that that are achievable, that are actionable, that are measurable, that we can get to and we can ultimately claim victory around, or we don't actually understand when we are successful, where we're not, and as a result, what we need to do differently over time. So I think the ZTA helps us as a business, whatever size we are, to self-assess, perhaps with external guidance if we're not critically able to do that ourselves because we're so deep in it, we can't see the forest because of the trees, but to raise ourselves up, to look critically at our infrastructure, at our process, at our human as well as intellectual and physical capital and facility, and to understand what is good, to understand what is lacking. And by the way, lacking isn't bad. You never heard me say bad in this conversation, and people often take that the wrong way. Oh, we're lacking. That means we're not doing things correctly. What it means is you're not doing things. And we have to change what you're doing to have you do other things so that we can offset the liability, right? And indeed the potential and perhaps the impact of not doing those things. But it's not bad. It's an opportunity to do better. And you have to look at it that way to understand it. And we then can create a plan that will let us over time manage ourselves, hopefully, to a better place. But the ZTA is just one example of best practice guidance that's been around for decades, as I talked about earlier. It is commonsensical to say we should identify risk, we should assess it, we should identify it ongoing, assess it ongoing. We should look at it holistically and not simply in one silo as a fixed point of entry and exit in our organizations on our boundaries, right? But not everybody has seen that and understood that.
It seems like
this is what the ZTA does for us. It broadens that thought process.
Yeah, I get that. And I think one of the things that ZTA, the way you explain it, seems like it's more business process reengineering or business process analysis. Almost, it's like every time I get into a GDPR conversation with companies, I end up having to bring on their general counsel and their business process folks. And technology folks are really shocked by that because of they think it's a technology solution. They can wave a magic wand and GDPR goes away, but it impacts business process as deeply as it does the actual the technology. And so I'm curious if you think the similar thing will play out with zero trust.
So it is an interesting time, right? For many reasons. GDPR is one example. You've got the equivalent localized in the United States, in California, for instance, right? With emerging legislation over the last year and a half that is basically roughly approximate. The US is a little bit different. We can't really, for the most part, claim that we have federal statutes and regulation of privacy to the same degree that the GDPR provides, right, for the Eurozone or the European Union. Let me use the proper formal term before people get upset. But you can tell, by the way, how old somebody is and how long they've been doing this if they call it the Eurozone versus the EU, the European Union. But the reality is that, you know, the GDPR is one example, right, I think, of an emerging trend. Europe has, for many decades, led the way with regards to these kinds of legislative endeavors. They've been out front and leading the world with regards to human rights and the focus on human rights, with regards to intellectual property protection, with regards now to privacy as an extension of human rights specific to the individual in the area of the GDPR. Before that, the 9546 directive on privacy that the GDPR replaces. And, you know, as the rest of the world watches and over time perhaps sees the need to laterally or perhaps even forcefully move forward in certain areas, I think it's not so much what the legislation requires and the intersection of the technology and the legislation that becomes the nexus, right, or the focal point for dialogue. It's another tactical element on the checklist you have to check off and be aware of, to your point. There's no doubt about it. I think the more interesting, the broader strategic implications of that movement are that it used to be that you could say, you know what, I'm just not worried about that legislation. I don't have to take it into account because I'm not going to do things that are, for the most part, going to be impactful. And therefore, you know, I just don't care. And if I do care, you know, chances are good they're never going to get their act together enough to fine me. And if I ever live to see a fine, I'll fight it in court, and it's never going to really be an issue. But today, you know, we see evidence of the fact that big technology companies have made decisions that, on the surface anyway, seem to indicate that those resources that they are forced to give up in order to operate are acceptable burdens to them in terms of the liabilities associated with operating under GDPR. They're willing, in other words, to encounter fines and pay them as a cost of doing business, as opposed to changing their business model, at least on the surface. When you look at Facebook, you look at Google, you look at Microsoft, you look at Apple, you know, you look at almost every major technology behemoth in the world that has run afoul of that regulation within the first 2 years of it existing, and the fines that they have been assessed. And, you know, to them, I'm not making light of the money. I'm certainly not making light of the impact or the need for that thought process. But I get the sense they look at it and say, you know what, we spend more than that on paper clips every year. Just write the check. I don't want to deal with the fact that I'm going to interrupt my business model and change my perception of profit and loss to pay a fine. It just doesn't seem to make sense to them. And I think that, you know, if you follow that leadership, you run into the risk as a small and medium-sized business of saying, well, if they're not going to do it and it's not important, then why should I? And, you know, if you're not a company that spends more than that fine on paper clips every year, you probably need to pay attention because you can't afford the fine. And I think that strategic risk planning, as opposed to risk mitigation, is something that we don't really spend time on as organizations. Again, when I say we, I mean at the C level in most organizations. I'm not suggesting that there isn't a thought process around strategic planning. I think we've all drank that Kool-Aid years ago, and I think most companies understand the value of strategic planning. But strategic planning, the next business cycle about how you're going to go out and win market share and what the new products and services are that are going to help you to do that, and looking back on the prior year and celebrating your success and bemoaning your failures and saying you're going to do better, is not the same thing as strategically understanding how to plan to manage risk. Those are very, very different conversations. And I don't think businesses are spending enough time assessing the competitive landscape from a threat and risk perspective. They do it reactively.
Yeah.
But that's not assessment. That is after the fact, trying to catch up and stay value neutral in terms of the overall impact and liability you incur. I don't think there's enough forward-thinking thoughts, right, going on, discussions happening around what GDPR potentially, what high trust potentially in the US, what HIPAA over the last decade and a half, approximately of its existence potentially, what those kinds of thought processes are, even if we're not directly impacted by it. You know, we're seeing throughout the world a drive towards the need for better understanding of equality and of action equaling ultimately equality and respect for individuals and the needs for that in every sector, in every place, regardless of what it is and regardless of what we do, without coloring that conversation or those statements politically in any way, just generically, right? We're seeing that everywhere. And I think, businesses that are seeing that and turning a blind eye to it because they don't feel it's going to impact them are wrong. And I think they're going to find over time that businesses that are strategically thinking about how to level the playing field are going to be addressing risk as part of addressing the need for social alignment. And I think you're going to see those things are intersecting. And the businesses that are going to do that are going to be the ones that are going to come out on top. But it's going to require a realignment of thought process around how we manage technology to achieve that.
Yeah, I think that the CFO has a distinct advantage versus the security and IT leader, just because they have a set of guidelines that probably was developed around, I don't know, time of Egypt or Middle Ages, but it's been a long time coming. It's GAAP accounting principles, debits, credits, balance sheet, income statement. It's defined. You can still break it, but you go to jail. And so there's a defined amount of principle around how you account for profit and loss in a business, and how you account for, this is what goes to the federal government based on your profitability, et cetera. So I do think
it's very quantitative, right? To just use the language of risk. It's a quantitative set of metrics, right? You can't not make money if you sell more than it costs to produce, right? I mean, you've made money by definition. It's very quantitative.
And when they get a financial audit, you're getting audited based on this, but they never tell you how to fix it. They're just like, you've got material weakness. If it's on the bank or credit union side, on the IT, on the technology side, we've got everybody fighting to be heard. High trust, GDPR, HIPAA,
high tech, all the different.
I mean, it's a mess. It's a mess. So what's the 80-20? Is all roads lead to NIST? Like if I'm a decision maker, I'm like, all right, listen, this is very noisy. I'm hired here to help my business make money and keep everybody employed. I got to get, what's the one regulation that I can focus on where that tide rises all boats? Is that NIST, do you think?
Yeah, I don't think it's NIST. I think NIST inhabits a very interesting place, right? It is best practice guidance. It does not have the force of law. It is not a regulation. There's no statutory compliance fine if you don't follow it. There's no attaboy, good job if you do, right? I mean, it just doesn't work that way. Sure. There's very few things that carry the force of law, and even fewer that carry the force of law beyond the boundary of an individual geographic location, meaning a nation-state border. The GDPR is one of the only examples we can point to that is truly multi-nation spanning in its impact and scope. There certainly are treaties that nation states agree to. The Wassenaar Arrangement, for instance, with regards to dual-use goods is a great example. But there are very few. The Basel Accords for bank secrecy and compliance, right, is another one. But there are a few of those by definition. There just are not many, even less so in the modern era in the last 20 to 40 years. And there have been, especially in our area in IT and security, because it's just not a primary focus for governments, right? They're more concerned, or have been until maybe around the end of the Cold War and slightly afterwards, around weapons control and arms control. That's been the theme of modern nation state decision and guidance making with regards to treaties. Now the environment in the last 20 to 30 years has really shifted into that primary position, although it's been off track recently. But certainly it would be hard for you to make an argument that the environment is going to be replaced by IT and by InfoSec security as the #1 priority globally for people. But I do think, at least for the next generation, but I do think that indirectly, we are seeing evidence everywhere, right, of the confluence of those streams we've been talking about and the convergence of them. You don't have to look very far under the hood of any of the dialogues you see and hear about that are occurring between governments. The Brexit conversation is a great example between Great Britain, the United Kingdom, the rest of the EU, about how they're going to negotiate essentially a divorce, right, a parting of the ways. And while they're still struggling to get it done and continuing to push back that deadline, slowly but surely, we're marching towards the inevitable announcement of here's how we're going to do it. And guess what? We've decided to ignore these things and we're just not going to address them right now because nobody can decide what to do with an open border for Ireland and whether we're going to have one or not. So we're just not going to talk about it right now. But we are going to agree on these core fundamental principles around money, around insurance, around cross-channel trade, and around the regulation of privacy with regards to the right of the individual, because those are non-negotiable and there's really not a lot of wiggle room there.
Yeah.
You know, technology plays a part in all of that, yet we don't see it as a separate entity because we feel if we cover it there, it's okay, right? Well, cloud services, right? You're going to apply PII, personally identifiable information, or PHI, right? Health-related personal information, or PMI, medical information, whatever you want to refer to it as. You're going to apply those protections to that information broadly under GDPR, holistically, with a right to be forgotten and a right to claim that you have the ability to correct misinformation, and we'll be okay. Well, perhaps we will, perhaps we won't. I don't think we're ever going to see a negotiated set of treaties that span nation states with regards to risk management, and information security. But what I see more and more is the need for, and indeed the evidence that there is kind of under the surface, an acknowledgement of certain standards and frameworks, to your point in your question earlier, that should be reliably used as measuring sticks or yardsticks around that. Although they're not globally accepted by everybody, they are accepted by enough people and well-defined enough that we use them. I think NIST does inhabit that world. And I think ISO, in particular, ISO 27001 and 27002, for instance, the ISMS, the Information Security Management System architecture document in 27001, the foundation of the modern information security management infrastructure we all have, and ISO 27002, the control elements that should be applied through the architecture filter of 27001. You see technology discussions, risk discussions, documentary evidence of those kinds of frameworks and thought processes that are not so esoteric, but are rather kind of mainstream. When I say esoteric, you know, you can point to frameworks like the Zachman framework, for instance, right? Which is a great framework, but in the man's own words, it is hard to understand, let alone making it simple for the average human who's not a classically trained scholar to figure out what the hell he's talking about, right? And I love the Zachman framework. It is a great framework for understanding how to carve up role and responsibility and assess that architecture within an organization. It's fundamental to what we do, but it is overly complicated, right, for the average human to apply. But when you look at something like ISO guidance, ISO 31000, the standard for risk and risk assessment, risk management at the ISO level, you got the equivalent in NIST with NIST SP 830R1, the general document for risk and risk assessment, NIST SP 837R2, what most people commonly call the risk management framework, right, the RMF. You know, when you look at even NIST SP 800-171, which is the underlying document, the genesis document for what we now call, right, ultimately the CMMC. That's where the CMMC aligns from and ultimately is linked to, along with other guidance that the government, the US government has provided. But when you look at those kinds of documents and you say there's a body of evidence both at the NIST level, although NIST is considered global these days, at the ISO level, if you don't like NIST because it's United States centric and carries the liabilities of that in some people's minds outside the US. But whatever it is, if you look at those kinds of documents and the guidance they provide, again, not the force of law, there's no regulatory compliance issue if you don't implement ISO 27001. But there is a lot of benefit. And I think what we need to do is tell better, more compelling stories and create better, more compelling cost-benefit analyses that demonstrate the value of these frameworks and highlight the potential risks associated with not implementing them. And then what we need to do is politely but formally beat up our supply chain and force them with a velvet glove to be able to understand the value of aligning with us if we are the driver in that business model. NIST SP 800-161, which is the standard for vendor and risk management assessment in the vendor supply chain, is an often overlooked guidance document that is so crucial, especially in the world today, right? In the multi-vendor, globally spread out supply chain, disassociated world we live in. And those are areas where the gaps are apparent. It's not what I do to service you as a customer. It's what the people that provide me the raw materials that I provide to you do. And if the raw materials suck, for lack of a better way of putting it, because they're not secure, then the end product is going to suck and it's not going to be secure. And I can blame them all I want, but you as the customer are going to hold me, right, ultimately to be accountable, not the person 3 layers down in my supply chain somewhere else in the world who made a mistake. And companies for decades have ignored that lateral and ultimately that downward flowing risk and have said, we're not worried about that, right? We're just going to make it look pretty when we package it up and it'll be good enough. Well, good enough isn't good enough anymore. And if you can't manage your supply chain and you can't control it, regardless of whether you own it yourself or it is outsourced, if you can't make it standardized and make it acceptable and validate with auditability throughout that supply chain that you meet certain minimum requirements, you're going to struggle to do business. And it's going to be a very rude awakening for companies.
Well, Adam, I really appreciated our conversation today. I know we're at the end of our time together. Is there anything in particular that popped in your head as we were talking that you really wanted to close with? Is there anything that you thought was worthwhile that you were hoping I'd ask you that you want to summarize with? And then I'd like to give everybody a link to go learn more about you and your organization after that.
Sure. So, you didn't ask me my favorite color and you didn't ask me what I like as my favorite food. I was kind of bummed. I was hoping you would do that, but all kidding aside, right? It's black, by the way, and I love pizza in case anybody wants to know, but all kidding aside, Bill, it's first of all, thank you. It's been a great opportunity to chat with you and spend some time with you formally. We've chatted informally, but it's always nice to have more of a directed conversation, right, around some interesting topics. And hopefully those of your audience that are watching or will watch at some point in the future found it to be insightful and hopefully a good way to spend the time that we've spent together. Yeah, I think in closing and wrapping up, one thing I would just touch on or ignite, right, in terms of our conversation, bring back to the fore, is the need to think strategically. And again, I think companies are doing that, but I think they overestimate and undervalue what strategic thinking is, as we talked about. I think it's beyond the look back, the look forward, and the ability to figure out how to win the hearts and minds of our customers and take away market share, right, from our competitors. That's strategic thinking, but it's not the same thing as thinking strategically about how you operate a business in the modern world. And you have to look beyond the boundary of engagement and winning market share in order to think strategically today. And I would just challenge people to consider that and think about the role risk, change, and ultimately technology can play, right, in those conversations. It's an interesting place to find yourself today.
Yeah, I love that. I love the broad thinking. I love, and my listeners are going to love that because they do appreciate that, and they need everybody needs to be reminded because it's so easy to jump into problem solving mode because most of the listeners are great problem solvers, or they wouldn't be at the top of the food chain of their business solving lots of problems. So someone reminding them to think this way is really useful.
It is important. And, I would finally close with, just the thought, there's an ancient Chinese saying, right? There's always seems to be one that's appropriate for every situation if you look hard enough, but there's one that is a favorite of mine. It's a blessing, but also a potential warning at the same time. And it's, when you say to somebody, may you live in interesting times, right? And, the reality is that we do live in interesting times, but we have to be careful what we wish for because interesting can be opportunity. It can be chaotic, it means churn, but it is at the same time the ability to go back and reinvent yourself, right? Potentially, maybe not to the extent of being the phoenix rising from the ashes of the chaos and the destruction, but I think it is a cautionary tale that if you're not careful and you're not willing to embrace change and embrace that thought process of what interesting times mean, that you will be left behind, and your customers as well as your employees will vote, right, with their feet if you are not prepared to embrace the needs of the organization and to challenge the operational landscape you see unfolding before you. So
yeah, it's one of my favorite books is the Dao De Ching, which is the Chinese great philosophy and almost Zen-like in nature, but very simple. And it's a, you can be a tree that's really rigid in the stiff breeze, or you can bend, and still, be very malleable and understand. You still be a strong tree, but if you're stiff,
you fall over.
Take you over.
Absolutely.
I appreciate this, Adam, very much, and thank you for your time. And you need to tell me and my listeners about how to reach you.
Absolutely, and thank you for the opportunity to do that. So my name is Adam Gordon, as you might remember from the beginning of this conversation. You can certainly find me on LinkedIn. That's where I do most of my professional networking, and certainly just look me up. You could find my profile there. But my company, the company I work for full-time, is ITProTV. We are in the e-learning space. We often think of ourselves as the Netflix of e-learning, but we do provide companies and individuals with all sorts of certification as well as non-certification based content. And I'm sure the URL will show up magically here as we're talking. Bill will provide it to you, but we are able to provide content globally. We're a subscription-based platform, so you can either do individual or corporate memberships and find us there. I'm what we call an edutainer, essentially a fancy way of talking about being an educator and a trainer in our world. And I spend about half my time throughout the year on that platform developing content and teaching courses like the CISSP course, for instance, for ISC Squared, many other certifications. I specialize in infrastructure and security. So if it has to do with those things, you will likely see me. And then I spend about half my time, as I said, consulting with companies and individuals globally. So you can find me all over the place doing all sorts of things.
That's great, Adam. Yeah, that's going to be very interesting because I know you're teaching several hundred people with CISSP right now, or at least last time we talked it was.
I am. I have a boot camp I'm running because of these interesting times right now at night, 2 times a week for free, by the way, for 250 people right now. We're coming to the end of it. We're about to start a cloud security CCSP boot camp for ISC Squared, another one of their certifications, not officially for ISC Squared, just the ISC Squared certification. And we'll be doing another CISSP bootcamp late in the year, early in January, before the change in the CISSP CBK in May of 2021. So I do all sorts of stuff, and it's always interesting and exciting. But I love teaching, and I love spending time with people that want to learn.
Thanks, Adam. This is great. Okay, until next time, I appreciate it very much. Bye-bye.